Hello, family and friends and fans of Felicity. This is week 5 of Felicity's NICU journey, and the last week of her journey as she has now discharged from the hospital, graduated from the NICU. Her full NICU stay was 35 days, which is actually pretty short given her weight, given her condition. Much thanks to all the prayers, love, and support that went our way. She has now, or we asked last week that she could hopefully it was a Hail Mary wish that she'd be able to come home by Mother's Day. And Mother's Day is in a couple of days, and she is now here in our home with us now. So thank you so much for your prayers. In this video, I'm gonna talk about the last week of her NICU stay. She was classified as a feeder and grower, and typically that is the longest stretch for a premature infant to be in the NICU. That is the longest part of the road, and we managed to be able to do it relatively quickly, much to the surprise and shock of the doctors and medical staff. So stick around. I'm going to share some things in this video as I kind of give an update of this last week and into the NICU nerd out of some core principles, some um, things you can do as a parent if you're ever in this situation, and how you can advocate and apply these principles and advocate for your child to hope to get them out of the NICU sooner and into your loving arms in your home with a quicker discharge. So, with that, here is the update of this last week. As I said, she was fine as a feeder and grower, and the doctors were speculating at the beginning of this week that she'd be in here for another, 2 to 3, maybe even up to a month. She would discharge closer to her due date, which was June 1st, and right now it's May, and she left May 7th. So yeah, this week she was a feeder and a grower. So the challenge was getting her to finish that whole bottle of milk. And you can see in this picture that this was earlier this week. I finally, after much struggle, was actually able to get her to take a whole bottle of milk by mouth. And there she is. There we go. Chug-a-lug-a-lug. Chug, 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 chug. And once you can get your baby to take over up to 100% of their feeds, then they are going to put your baby on, they monitor her for a few more days, like 3 days, 2 days without the NG tube, the nose tube. And then after that, she is good to discharge. And here you go. You have her all, we passed the car seat test. We were able to get her into car seat and she handled it well. And then there's that picture. We were able to go to the NICU and take a photo. And that's her going into the world. And her shirt says, "Now the adventure begins." So just to summarize how she discharged, she was born April 2nd, weighing about 3.8 pounds. She was in the NICU for exactly 35 days, so 5 weeks on the day. She was born, her gestational age was 31 weeks, and she now has left the NICU at 36 weeks, so 5 weeks total, 4 weeks before her due date. And she's doing fantastic, doing absolutely well. Thank you, family, friends, loved ones, friends in the Covenant Christian community. That's my church group, as well as my dear friends in the Peterson Academy, for all your love and support. And so now I'm going to pivot into the NICU nerd out section, where I'm going to share what exactly Lauren and I did as parents for Felicity, just to make leaps and bounds in her progress into discharge at this early date. So if you're a NICU parent, you may find this next section useful. So, if you've been following along on Felicity's NICU journey, remember last week for the week 4 update, I explained this chaotic room situation where we had to get moved out of the neonatal intensive care unit because there was a surge in our community of preterm born infants. There were so many infants being born at the hospital, they were having to turn away mothers in labor to other nearby hospitals. That hardly has ever happened before. All the nursing staff there were shocked. They don't remember that ever happening before. And so because of that, we had to be roomed with another family. And as I mentioned in the last update, it was very chaotic, very noisy, and any progress that Felicity has made up to that point, she lost. She backslid because of the chaotic, noisy environment. And then last week, but then I mentioned that we were moved to another room. It was felicitous. It was well suited. That because of that situation, we actually were able to have a pediatrics room. Now, the care in the pediatrics room is not as intensive as the neonatal intensive care unit. It's a step down unit. Technically, Felicity should have been in the NICU, but that was okay because the pediatrics rooms were much larger. They had a bed, a couch, and a own private shower, which meant Lauren and I could stay 24/7 in with Felicity. We didn't have to room at the Walden House. That was kind of the assisted. The Walden House is like a McDonald house where families facing hardship can stay, and it's nearby the hospital. We were able to move out of the Walden House because of this hospital situation and actually live in 24/7 with Felicity. And that was key for Felicity's rapid progress in her last week. You see, she was projected by the doctors that she would have to stay probably another month. So 3 weeks from today, she would still be in the hospital, and that she would discharge much closer to her original due date. But because of that rooming situation, we were able to live 24/7, and there's something about living 24/7 with your child. These premature infants were not meant to be evicted from the womb. They need the constant human connection that only a mother um, can give to the fetus, and they're evicted out early. And so even with all the highly competent medical staff, and trust me, our nursing staff, our doctors at Kootenai were highly competent, well trained, very well educated. And despite even with all the high tech technology we have to incubate these babies and keep them living and keep them breathing, nothing can replace the constant parental contact a fetus infant or a fetus infant is supposed to have, what she's been adapted to have for millions and millions of years. We have not been gestating babies outside of the womb. They have been in that maternal uterine environment. And so because we were able to live 24/7 with our daughter, we were more able to replicate, not fully, but much more closely, that 24/7 constant human connection with Felicity. And that is what has spurred her rapid progress and surprised the doctors. She went from being projected to 1 month projection stay down to a week, was able to discharge. And she went from eating 20% of her food by mouth up to 100 within just a few days. She just took off and it clicked. And that was because we had that 24/7 constant human connection environment to really facilitate, cultivate her cognitive development. So, because of this felicitous rooming situation, Lauren and I were able to, because we were able to be with Felicity 24/7, we were able to implement what is known or what is called as the Family Ecological Approach to premature infant development. It's a very idealistic approach to medical care, not something that can so easily be implemented in the clinical setting due to logistics and architectural design. But if you can have that family ecological approach, it is most ideal for the baby. So, what is that approach? I'm going to pull up an image here. This is the family ecological approach. It is here you have you have the infant in the center, and obviously they're the patient. But the direct caregivers are not the medical staff. It is actually parent one and parent two, mom and dad, and they're integrated into a family system. And so what the NICU is designed to do is not necessarily care directly for the patient, although they're going to do that, but their emphasis is to care for the family system, to treat the infant as an integral part of the family, and so to treat the parent. And so there's going to be, in the family ecological approach, the philosophy shifts. Instead of treating just the patient, you treat the whole, and you see the patient as a part of an integral system. So there's going to be a lot more educating of the family, supporting the family, so that mom and dad can do the cares themselves. Quite often, quite often, due to logistics, family can't be in 24/7 giving direct care to the infant because there's just not enough room in the hospital. I was looking on the internet. We had this 24/7 stay in this nice room with this private shower because of the situation. But in the NICU, you can sleep overnight in the NICU, but it's really crammed, crowded. Only one parent can really stay in there at a time. They're going to be an overnight stay. And so it's not really ideal. That's why they have the Walden House or the McDonald House down the road so that you can leave for the night, get well rested, and come back. And as I was looking on the internet, researching other parents going through this, a lot of NICUs, especially if the hospital was designed, not within the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of hospitals just have a big room filled with about 6 to 8 preemie patients in there, and they're separated, partitioned off by curtains. And so it's a very noisy and crowded environment, and you're seeing other families. If they're losing a child, you'll see those intimate moments, those horrific moments. And so it creates kind of an atmosphere, a culture that doesn't really support the family system, sustain the direct parent-child um, contact. What facilitates that is creating a good architectural design, a good culture, where that is understood that the parents are the direct caregivers and the NICU staff is there to help the parents care for the infant. Now, obviously, some of that is outside the hospital's control. Even if you have the most ideal hospital, parents have to work quite often. They don't get long extended FMLA like they do in Sweden. By the way, side note on Sweden, if you're going to have a baby as a high risk pregnancy, Sweden, Japan, and Iowa are actually the best places to have a premature infant. They have the best technology, the best educated medical institutions there. But Sweden itself, as you understand, they have a lot better um, culture surrounding the rearing of children and birth. In America, we got to return to work pretty quickly. That's why you need a community to understand that, hey, parents, they may not be able to work. Um, but if we value the life of this child, we're going to try and create a culture where the parents are going to be in a place in life where they can be constantly with that infant, caring for that infant. So there's some cultural things in here that need adjusting for this vision to be implemented. Now, the founder of this, well, and the reason why we do this is because um, the infant, while they're a fetus, has 24/7 contact with the parent, with mom. And so when they're evicted out by being born prematurely, they lose that contact. And so by supporting the parents, you're giving that and keeping a consistent caregiver through the parents. See, changing parents um, confuses the infant. What they need is a constant caregiver. They need that consistency. And so having this family ecological approach to caregiving really helps facilitate and meet the needs of the infant. Now, as I said, this is very idealistic, not likely to be implemented. But I want to introduce the founder of this approach because this approach, this family ecological approach, is part of a much bigger philosophy to medicine. It's part of Dr. Heidelise Al's work, and I've introduced her in, I believe, the second week update. And I want to kind of revisit her some more because I've done a deep dive of research into this, and I found her work Incredibly enlightening and helpful in this journey, and I want to share with other NICU parents. So Heidelise Als, she was a developmental psychologist, born in Germany, immigrated to America, so suffered through much of the World War II chaos, uh, and became a developmental psychologist at Harvard, very prestigious university, and worked at the Boston Children's Hospital. And during the time, premature care was not really a priority in healthcare, and there was very little known about it. When she came on the scene, they had NICUs, but the primary emphasis in the NICUs was to just keep the babies breathing. If we can get them breathing, um, good. What Heidelise Als was concerned about was not just getting them to breathe in the short term, but ensuring that their cognitive development, the trajectory of how their brains will operate for the rest of their life, was safeguarded and preserved in those precious moments. And the questions she would bring is, how can we make care, this life-saving treatment of getting these babies to breathe again, making sure physically that they're okay, in the body, how can we ensure that their brains are properly properly developing at this time? And so that was her life work, and she's pioneered much work in neonatology, and she's not really well known as a developmental psychologist outside of the neonatal intensive care world. But I think that her work ought to be respected, more well known, and more broadly in psychology circles. So I hope that by sharing this, if you are a student of psychology, that you'll find what I'm about to share um, with her synaptic model of development and her NIDCAP. Those are two clunky words I'm going to explain here in a bit. I hope that you will find it beneficial in whatever you are studying, but particularly for NICU parents, I hope that by sharing this her thesis, her life work with you, you'll be more empowered to advocate on the care of your premature infant. She just passed away in 2024, I believe. And she kind of came onto the digital scene late in her life. She was still doing academic work well into her 80s, but she doesn't have much video, audio work out there on the internet, so it's very, very limited. She spoke about a year before she passed away at a Sweden conference, and just great work she shared, but her views on YouTube are like dismally low. I think, but the information she's conveying is top notch. So I wanted to share one interview I found from her by a journalist, Sarah De Gregory. If you are a parent who is new to the preemie parenting world, I would recommend you read this book first, Early, by Sarah De Gregory. Great book that kind of gives you an overarching look at neonatology, the care of premature infants. She had her own daughter who was born at 26, 24 weeks, I believe. Um, Kind of makes the journey far less scary, gives lots of good knowledge, good information that can empower you. And it's on Audible too. So if you're a preemie dad going back and forth between the hospital and home, trying to keep the ship afloat, you can listen to this. It'll be very helpful. Anyway, she was able to track down Dr. Heidelise Als before she passed away and interviewed her. And she asked Dr. Heidelise Als what she would do if she were in charge of NICU design. She said the units would look almost nothing like they do now, with multiple babies in one room, cramped, small NICU rooms. Instead, they would consist of individual womb rooms, each kept at the temperature and humidity level of an incubator, an atmosphere that would be preserved by some sort of double-door airlock system, so that people could go in and out without letting in cool, dry air. Inside, a baby would live with loved ones, ideally primarily the baby's parents, but also a rotating cast of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close friends. Siblings would be welcome. Much of the time, the baby, who could still be attached to various respiratory supports, IVs, and monitors, would be snuggling skin to skin on one of the loved one's chest. The room would also be equipped with double beds and recliners, a private bathroom, nutritious meals would be provided. Each room would basically be a huge incubator, big enough for the whole family. Al's vision, which she knows is unlikely to be realized anytime soon, reflects her belief that one of the most significant losses preterm babies experience is the deprivation of constant, gentle human connection. And she has found that that loss and everything that goes with it has consequences for brain development. So because of the rooming situation that Lauren and I experienced, we were able to have this womb room-like situation. What Heidelise Als would envision as the perfect situation for a baby, and we were able to be in the situation and be 24/7 with Felicity and give that constant human connection for her cognitive development. And to the surprise of all the doctors, her progress just took off, just increased at such a rapid pace. And they kept telling us, oh, she's going to backtrack and slide. She's making huge bounds, but she's going to slide back. She didn't slide back. She just kept going and going and going. And I believe that's because we were able to emulate, put into practice Heidelise Al's more closely to Heidelise Al's vision of neo-intensive care. So by combining this ecological family integration, this family ecological approach with NIDCAP, which I'll explain in a minute, and Al's Synactive model, which I'll also explain, we are able to foster the neurodevelopment, stronger bonding, and a dramatically shorter hospital stay for our daughter, Felicity. All right, so it's one thing to create a good philosophy, to have a good theory. It's whole nother thing to be able to implement it and put into practice. And Heidelise Als was able to do that rigorous work. She was able to take her great knowledge of neurodevelopment and developmental psychology and put it into practice in a way that could be communicated to clinicians, doctors, and nurses. And this was known as NIDCAP, fun acronym. It's NIDCAP is the Newborn Individualized Care and Assessment Program. And the core philosophy of NIDCAP is ecological and relational. Instead of trying to make the baby conform to hospital policy, benchmarks that you think that they should be reaching, instead you change the hospital setting. You change the environment to the baby. And you do that based on the cues the baby is giving off. So instead of conforming the agent, the baby, to the environment, the arena, you build the arena around the baby that best meets the baby's needs. Because that's exactly how it is in the womb. The babies are the boss. The environment is completely suited to them when they're in the uterine environment. When they're in the extrauterine environment, they lose that sacred space for them, that time of just cultivation. And so her philosophy is to recreate the womb. And the core principle she has is she does this by reading the baby's language so that you can adapt care to calibrate it particularly to their language. And the benefits of NIDCAP is she has been able to show that there's improved brain structure, shorter NICU stays, better feeding weight gain, stronger infant parent bonding, and long-term neurological developmental gains that have been shown in the longitudinal study. I'm going to share, but in order to do this, the key part is knowing the baby's cues. So it requires deep attention, deep, constantly observing how the baby is responding to care and then adjusting your care to that baby. And I'm going to share an example from my experience applying this, because all about learning the baby's language. The babies have a language, you just have to learn how to speak it. So I'm going to share this me bottle feeding here.
Oh wow, you so know. side-eye that she's giving
Mm.
Kaden right now.
So as you can see, when Felicity, although she's mostly got it down, she still has to learn how to coordinate sucking, swallowing, and breathing at the same time. So often, if I tilt it up when she's sucking like that, and I watch her, and when she stops, I tilt the bottle down so there's no flow. You can hear her catching her breath. And then we do it again, just like that. So as you can see from that video, I'm talking about how babies cannot coordinate sucking and swallowing yet and breathing at the same time, especially when they're born preterm. And so as the parent, it requires you really observing the cues of the baby, because it's not natural for them. And then you have to co-regulate, help regulate that response, for them because they cannot do it themselves. A few other things with the cues, from personal experience of bottle feeding our baby. When we were in that shared room for a minute, a couple days, it was very chaotic and noisy. And when I was trying to bottle feed Felicity with the noise, she would actually completely shut down. Like she would go limp when I was trying to bottle feed. That's because she's trying to learn this new skill, which is hard for her little baby brain to do. But on top of that, there is stimulation of the noise in the room itself. And as a response to that overstimulation, her autonomic nervous system just shut down. She would just go, her arms would go limp. It's not because she's exhausted necessarily, that's because she's overstimulated, and that is her cue. That is her cue, and that's how she responds to the environment. If the environment is too overwhelming, the premature infant is not at a point in their development where they can just tune out the noise with the bottle being put in their mouth. They literally go limp. That is the only way they can respond. Another thing about premature infants with their cues. When you when remember in a few weeks ago I shared how I do hand hugs because they're trying to look for the extrauterine walls when they're stressed. They're trying to find that support system from the uterine walls, the womb, and so you can give them a hand hug. So that's one of the cues you can read. Another thing when you're bottle feeding a baby, if they're too overstimulated, they can arch their back sometimes, and that could be reflux and gas, but that could also be overstimulation. They can bear down like they're trying to poop when they're not really pooping. Another sign of overstimulation is because they do not have the attentional systems developed in their brain yet to direct their attention. They respond to overstimulation with other systems in their body. Good example of this is if you're eye gazing with a baby, a premature infant. Preemies, term infants can look at an object and they can move their gaze away when they've been sufficiently entertained by it, sufficiently stimulated. Babies that are premature, they do not have the ability to move their attention away. Think about this. In the womb, they really don't need that system online yet. It's not developed yet. And so if you're looking at your premature infant and you lock eyes and it's too overstimulating, what the baby could do in response to the overstimulation is either sneeze and start sneezing like crazy, which Felicity has done. When she's overstimulated, she will just respond with a series of sneezing, or they can just completely stop breathing because that's all they got in their handbag of tools. And so that is knowing those cues and is so important to knowing how to properly communicate with your baby because preterm infants do not communicate the same way that term infants do. And so what Dr. Heidelise Als did, with her work is document all these cues, observe these babies. So she would spend in her early in her career, she would just spend nights after nights just at the hospital watching babies, watching premature infants, and documenting everything. Because of that, she developed NIDCAP, and we have this education where we now know what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, which a lot of the cues and our response to those cues seem counterintuitive, like caressing your baby to soothe them. is what any mother would do, but doing that to a premature infant can be overstimulating. And so that language-based behavioral, watching for those behavioral cues, that is based on a larger thesis, and the life work of Heidelise als, and this is known as the Synactive model of behavioral development in babies. So Dr. Al's groundbreaking works begins with her 1982 paper. This is her life's thesis, you could say. The foundation of NIDCAP and the Family Ecological Approach. It's known as the Synactive theory of development. Now, synactive, syn, I believe, means multiple or subsystems. And what the idea of the synactive model of organization of behavioral development is that that the preterm infant, it views the preterm infant as an active self-regulatory system made up of 5 independent subsystems that constantly synact with each other and the environment. Now, when they're in gestation, these systems come online at different stages or different weeks of gestation. You have the autonomic that controls the breathing, respirations, heart rhythms. You have the motor system, movement, and that's happening also in the womb. Then you also have the state system, whether the baby is aroused, awake, whether they're sleeping, what stage of sleep they're in. Are they in light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, whatnot? Those are the state system comes online much later. And then you have the attentional, interactive system. Can they move their attention and make sense of things, focus on certain things? And all of these come online different. And that's why I love the image that she has here with this cone-like image, because I think it communicates it very well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, baby can't control their attentional system. And so, in order to respond to their inability to control attention, they have a autonomic response to the overload, or they will react in a motor state, or they may just go limp. That would be the state system taking over. And why is that so? It's because these systems, they come online during their certain weeks or stages of development, but they're not integrated yet. That comes online later, them being able to integrate. They come together in the womb, but are not differentiated and integrated. So, little neural anatomy lesson here of brain development. This is a review from week 2. I shared this, but in the second trimester, or 28 weeks, you can see that the brain has a lot less of what you would call our sulci, the little grooves, when the brain folds in on itself. So our brain is so massive, but the neuronal connections, in order to have as many neurons and connections that we have, the brain has to do these little folds to optimize and maximize all those connections. So there can be more, so to increase the surface area. So if we were to look at the brain of a 28-week-old baby, what you would see is not a brain that has all the grooves, the white matter. Instead, you would see a smooth orb-like thing. And as the baby brain develops into the third trimester, it goes through a massive growth spurt, and the brain gets myelinated. And it causes all these new connections to be made as the brain is folding in on itself. And that is what develops the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is what differentiates us. The size of our cerebral cortex and the proportion of the prefrontal cortex is what differentiates us from other animals. And that begins in the third trimester. So here's another image here of the cerebrum, the frontal lobe. You can see in dogs, very small. Looks like maybe 10% of the whole brain, if that. Squirrels are incredibly tiny. Rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees, our evolutionary relatives, much small area. Cats have hardly any. So why cats have no impulse control. Prefrontal lobe does that. If you open a door, the cat wants to walk through no matter what. go outside and it wants to walk right back through the door because the cat associates moving through with that opening and closing of the door. And they don't have a frontal cortex to regulate that impulse to walk through doors. So they're just stimulating creatures. They respond to stimulus. The prefrontal cortex is what allows man to think outside the box, to conceptualize, and to act in a way that is not a mere response to stimulation. So that's what makes us humans unique. Now, babies don't have babies they don't you don't get that wiring of the prefrontal cortex yet until the third trimester. And then also what is called now the fourth trimester, the 9 months following birth. Those get wired up. And that's kind of the evolutionary trade-off because our brains are so big and they need so much growth. We get born with highly malleable brains that require mother and father helping to facilitate those neuronal connections. Now, babies born preterm don't get that. And as a result, what is happening here is the cortex for perhaps you could say the vision cortex does not get properly wired up to the frontal cortex. The smelling and hearing and speech don't get properly wired up to the frontal cortex. So all those systems that I shared in the previous slide are at risk of not synchronizing, becoming synactive. When you miss out on that third trimester, they don't get wired properly. And because of that, the brain cannot communicate with the frontal lobe. That's the meaning-making engine of our brain. It can't do it. They are disconnected when a baby is born preterm. And that's why, here's the frontal is the attentional part. That's the last part that is wired up in a brain's development. When a baby can't direct their attention in an overstimulating environment, the brainstem, the motor cortex, the state systems, all these other lower regions of the brain have to take over the overstimulation. Now, I want to share some studies more on this, about the frontal lobe. This was taken from more of Al's works later. So Dr. Al's wrote her thesis in 1982, before the brain decade of the 1990s, before we had fMRIs, MRIs, EEGs, all these fancy stuff was just taking a boom. She made this proposal, and what is really quite amazing about her work is that time has proven with empirical evidence that she was right. So right here, it's an interesting image. They did a longitudinal study where they had infants on NIDCAP. This is at the time NIDCAP was experimental, and they had these children, these premature infants, cared for with NIDCAP protocol. That was their experimental group, up and against the regular NICU policy at the time. That was the controlled group. And then they followed these kids 8 years later, and this is what they discovered. As you can see, these are brain scans. So you have the front of each little circle is the nose, and then the back is the head, the back of the head, and then the little two squares on each side of the circles is the ears. And what these lines represent in these lit up areas represents the connectivity. With red lines, you see here is a stronger connectivity, connection. And so factor 7, factor 8, factor 4, and factor 7, what you see is stronger connectivity from the frontal regions of the brain to the back of the brain, the external regions. This was for kids that went through NIDCAP. The other images where you have blue lines, those represent actually weaker connections. And so kids that had NIDCAP actually had weaker, short-term connections, shorter connections that were connecting closer regions of the brain. And what Dr. Alice proposes in her paper is those shorter connections are more correlated with autism-like symptoms, autism spectrum disorder. They are more highly interconnected in subregions, but not holistically connected across the brain. And so, what children show who underwent NIDCAP as preterm infants is that they have that greater, longer holistical connection in various regions of the brain and less overwiring in closer regions of the brain. So it's a really cool study that really proves Al's synactive model of development. Here's another really cool image here. Is a scan that shows the white matter development. So in A, that is the controlled group. That is Preemie 2 weeks after discharge that did not undergo NIDCAP. And then B is the experimental group, the NIDCAP preemies. And what you see here, those red lines represent white matter development and connectivity. As you can see, there's a lot more white matter development represented by the red lines in the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex region. In B, that's the experimental group, as opposed to A, the typical NICU policies of the time. And then you can see the lower white lines, the black, those represent stronger functional organization, I believe, in the brainstem region connecting to the rest of the brain. There's a tighter, better knit structural function there. And that is those kids that underwent the NIDCAP protocol had that much stronger, much neatly organized brain. And then this one is really interesting. This is a longitudinal study. It followed both a control group and experimental group of babies up till they're 8 or 9 years old. And this is called the Ray-Osternath complex figure. And so what they would have is they would have children copy down while looking at an image, and they would copy it down, trace it pretty much. And then they would have the kid again take away the original copy and have the kid write it down, immediate recall. And then they would go about, talk to the kid for 20 minutes, have them play, and then do a delayed recall. And say, child, remember that picture I had you draw 20 minutes ago? Can you please redraw it? And what they showed here is the experimental kid. So let's go first the control. The kids that were born premature but did not have NIDCAP. They had poor tracing to begin with, but their immediate recall was dismal. They're able to recognize the face and whatnot, but they weren't able to actually kind of get the whole picture. They just had little sketches of details here and there, snippets of details. And then the delayed recall was even worse. Now the experimental group, oh, sorry, my baby's crying. Oh, it's okay, sweetheart. The experimental group, really good immediate tracing, immediate recall really well, and then the delayed recall is almost the same. And what Al's is showing here is what children have who have a safe who are born preterm but are still able to have an extrauterine environment that more accurately mimics the back and forth toing and froing between the baby's needs and the parent. Through NIDCAP is that they actually end up having brains that can get the gestalt of things. That's the holistic vision. They are able to have they're able to see things, hear things, touch things, and it properly integrates with the frontal cortex, the frontal lobes, and it stays in the memory. Can you imagine being born preterm and you're in that controlled group and you didn't undergo NIDCAP? That's what the world looks like with the immediate recall. Things don't stick in the brain. You can't get the whole picture of things. You get little snippets here and there, but you can't get the gestalt of your senses because it's just too overwhelming. You can't make sense of it. Versus ourselves, I'm not a preterm baby, but those who undergo NIDCAP, they're able to their senses are properly integrated, synapting together properly, and they're able to get the gestalt, understand it, let it stick in memory, and hold on to it much well. And so that is some psychometric measures of NIDCAP at work here. So yeah, this synactive theory has powerful neuroscience behind it. As I said, the third trimester and the early weeks of after birth are the critical wiring window, especially for that prefrontal cortex, which is the CEO and the self-regulation, attention and planning. The frontal cortex receives no direct sensory input. It depends on a well-organized signals that travel from the other lobes to the frontal cortex, those white matter highways. So a baby born premature misses out on that protected womb environment. Without cue-based care, without NIDCAP, the NICU overstimulation with all the alarms, the beeping, the chattering staff, um, outside the hospital room, someone mopping the floor with a big mop sounding thing, that can flood the immature brain, causing subsystems to protest and disrupting healthy wiring. This is where Hebb's principles, neurons that fire together, wire together, explains the magic. The preterm brain is highly plastic. Every experience shapes its connections. Talking like every experience, so each day is so important for a premature infant. Supportive modulated input, cue-based care, and parental presence helps the right neurons fire together, building strong, efficient pathways to that frontal cortex. Chaotic stimulation does the opposite. So as parents, what you are doing with the family ecological approach is that baby is not able to properly wire up those neurons on their own. So by having constant connection with your infant, you are helping them develop, helping them literally wire up their brains for success for the rest of their life. So that's why NIDCAP, the Family Ecological Approach, based on the science of the synactive model of development, is so critical. Because what occurs in these precious third trimester development, when the brain is hyperplastic, what you do in those few weeks will set the stage for the rest of their life. That's why it's so important that you create an ecosystem, not just for the infant herself, but for the family, the parents, so that they can become that womb again for the baby. And it really does require a village to raise a baby, but it requires an entire NICU hospital culture and broader culture to raise a preterm infant. So that's why going through this journey. I'm a huge advocate for more NIDCAP care in the hospital setting. Now, NIDCAP, Kootenai, where I'm at, was not a NIDCAP certified hospital. It still takes a while for ideas in academia to trickle in and get implemented into the clinical setting. But what you can do as a parent is you can advocate for this type of care, to be hands-on. Talk to your occupational therapist in the NICU, the speech therapist, the developmental team, and really educate yourself and learn how you can be more hands-on with your child. The hospital, there's kind of a culture with neo-intensive preemie babies, and the hospital was really impressed with Lauren and I because we were there 24/7, because they said a lot of parents let the hospital take care of their premature infant until their time to come home, and then they're hands-on. That typically tends to be the culture, and no fault on the parents. I still have work and everything gets in the way. You have to be able to keep your insurance to pay for the up nearward $1 million NICU bill that's going to be charged to you. So dad's got to work. Mom may even have to work too. However, and that's a broader cultural issue. But despite that, I think it's worth the sacrifice to be hands-on in your care. No amount of competency in the medical staff nor technological marvels can replace the womb-like experience, the constant connection. So if you're a NICU parent, learn your baby's cues, educate yourself, learn what's going on in little preemie brain and how they're communicating, and that way you can communicate properly to your infant. Do a lot of skin to skin care. In my week 2 update, I talked a lot about the neurological benefits of skin to skin care, but there's also physiological benefits. As I've been learning, there's sleep state. It's been argued that the only time babies enter into their deep sleep type state is when they're doing skin to skin care, because their hormones are regulated properly. They feed better too when you do that, but that requires parent in the NICU putting the naked baby on their naked chest. And the hospital staff can't feasibly do that. Maybe you don't have a premature daughter, but you have a premature granddaughter or a premature niece and nephew. Um, how can you be a support not to the baby but to that family itself? This journey, and I've been through a lot of things. I got kicked out of my former church in my early 20s. I broke both my knees. I've gone out of a bad relationship, a lot of stressors, but this stress of the NICU journey, this last 6 weeks, has been the most disorientating experience I've had that has stretched me to my limits. With that being said, if you are a loved one who wants to help your son, your friend, your sibling who's having a premature infant, um, asking them how you can help is not really helpful because they are in such crisis mode trying to um, help this baby, but what you can do is handle their logistics. See their house, okay, their grass is getting long, the house it's getting messy. um, my sister actually went and cleaned my house because it just got so chaotic, and that was a huge blessing. Just organizing things, because everyone wants to help, but having a having the mind to organize the logistics of receiving help is really difficult. And so if you have a loved one who's going through this journey, you can help cultivate that family ecological approach by handling the logistics of the day-to-day lives, because mom and dad are going to be 100% focused on making sure that baby is healthy, getting to the NICU as much as possible to be with their baby, and so a lot of um, personal life will fall to the wayside. Uh, and so you can do that to help them out. Don't Your job, I think, as the extended family is not to help the baby, but to support the family. And I've been blessed with my parents live close by now. They moved up here about a year ago. Same with my sister and my brother-in-law. So we've been really blessed to have that support net. Um, so that's all I have to share today. I will. That is week 5 of Felicity's NICU journey. I will be giving updates more on a monthly basis now because she's still a preemie and her development's going to be different than other infants. So I'll share what I'm learning in her development, but I'll do monthly updates because I'd like to study other things and focus on other things in life. But I thank you all for listening, keeping along this journey. So grateful for the love and prayers. She is now home. As you can see, she's in my arms. We're just chilling here. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.